Fault Lines, Chapter 1. When he first saw his Siha, his hands were warm and tingling from the pressure it took to snap a neck, the kick of the pistol into his palm, the cradling support of Nasana's life-lost body. His palms had calmed when he'd settled to prayer, but awoke again at the sight of her, at the sound of her. The completion of his purpose had been sudden and explosive, his patient waiting at an end, adrenaline surging through his system along with the satisfaction of success, and the blank space of his expected death unfilled. For a moment all these sensations and impressions coalesced in his mind, each strand of thought pulled into an arrow aimed at the presence of this woman with hair of fire and a face that matched, rifts in her skin that glowed red, scarred in curved lines around her deeper matte red eyes and sharp cheekbones. Something long lost stirred in his body, and his heart sped an errant few beats in realization before his breathing and control brought it to heel. His path was lit in that moment of satisfaction and expectation of death and emptiness. She was his Siha, and she did not know it yet, but he belonged to her. A lightning flash of revelation granted by Arashi. Her presence was a burning gift, given to him by the will of the gods. He awoke, sudden and vibrant from battle sleep, knowing this moment could be cherished, refreshed, and relived whenever he chose. It would be often. I just tore this place apart, looking for you. The least you can do is look at me. Her name was Shepard. He knew of her. As she spoke, he became more certain of the landmarks, of the map, of the rightness. Her cause was worthy and her path already set, and he need only set his feet behind her on that path and watch. That choice was done before she'd finished proposing it. The gods rarely granted such rightness, and he would not mistake the signs, would not set a foot awry. She was his will, and he would savor discovering what that was. His hands, tingling and warm and ready, belonged to her. They shook hands, a human custom, one he'd never indulged in before. He had not put a hand on anyone in years without intending death to be the result. The tingling grew, passing up his arm with the strength of omen. He spoke a prayer, as he did before each of his endeavors of life and death. This one, personal. The prayer for himself only. Amonkira, grant that my hands be steady, my aim be true, and my feet swift. He ended the prayer there. This was not a whim of the living to end a life. There was a greater will here that would not admit failure or even the possibility of doubt. This was a command to extend a life, something that had so far been beyond his reach. If he failed, he could only ask himself for forgiveness, and that would be futile. He was not a man of forgiveness. She'd asked for his willingness to die, and he gave it with both committed hands, informing her of the illness building in his blood, robbing him of breath. Robbing, but not robbed. Not yet. His breath was his strength and his steadying will, and he would not gasp. He would take each measured breath to the fullness of his ability for as long as life and breath were granted. Her face foretold that she would neither ask for nor grant forgiveness of her own should she fail. Should he fail. The cruelty of the landmarks were written in her face, in the harsh edge of her voice, in the cold demand in her eyes. Her face comforted him. He need not fear for her. She was not an innocent, unaware of what lurked in the dark. So often he dealt with ignorance, and it was a sharp pleasure to look into eyes that could understand who he was and demand his service, knowing the price. Too many people took on actions without knowing the price. She understood a dark path, and her red eyes provided the only light there. She would not understand that his path was lit by a will other than his own, a will whispered only to the Drell, only to him. He had met a Siha before, outrage and courage in her eyes. The gods knew that he knew the ways of Siha, could coax them to his hand, could survive their death, the outrushing breath of their withdrawn inspiration. That was proven. What was not yet proven was whether or not he would grant his life to this Siha and fail. The rightness was in giving his life, saving hers. A trade, Siha for Siha. His balance of rightness would rise from the negatives that pulled at him. He had been the cause of Erica being taken from her life while he still lived. He would be the cause of keeping Shepard in the world while he died. That symmetry guided his hands into servitude. His soul would travel to the shores, meet with Erica, serve her sunset eyes. His body, his breath, his life would serve this Siha with no less devotion, and with more experience and dedication. She would not die because of him. She would live beyond the end of his life in her service. He would not fail. There would be no forgiveness and no apologies. He was awake. He watched his teammates, watched his Siha with double-lidded eyes. Ethics were dry and rattling things to an assassin, fragile and apt to fly away in the wind, unattended. Stealth in motion and in thought were the essence of his utility and success. Any stuttering thought or rattling concern of ethics would be discarded in the same way that he would cull a shoe with a tendency to squeak. He contemplated this as he followed his path. Despite his training from Hanar and his respect for his mentors, he knew he had not been taught to possess true morality. Aided by the Drell philosophy of body will and spirit will, he had been used as a child, trained and indoctrinated. Indoctrinated. Now a further insidious term and concern, similar in many ways. Turned from family or friends or the potential of any such, toward the will of others. Unquestioning and unblinking. His morality had been replaced by Hanar training. He had been created as a weapon to serve, and when he had taken it upon himself to bring about the excruciatingly painful deaths of his wife's murderers, he had shed the illusions of morality and service. He could clothe himself in morality and service, speak of them with practiced wisdom, but they were merely his costume. And it was not his costume that ended lives and brought about the will of the gods. It had been required to transcend the will of his Hanar masters, and this was the result of disillusion. However painful, his spirit had finally risen and melded with his body's will. Morality and honor were words, never a shield against death, and his business was death. Though he had been raised with a mystical admonition against doing so, he had, finally, researched the lives more fully of those he had murdered at his master's insistence. He'd killed many people of morality and honor. He denied even more people, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, spouses, and children of a loved one. He had robbed the good of time spent with family. He had robbed the wicked of potential redemption, their souls burdened, never to be lightened by further time or wisdom. His words would grant no seam of conflict upon which to pry at his motivations. His words would be few, and they would be like water. Cut at them, and they would flow back together. His costume would be his skin, and his silence, and they would fit. Each endeavor must begin with a plan. He must know her, he must learn her, he must find the path to her. In Dante's towers he had evaded her until his purpose was done, and that showed him his further path. This lit path was only his to see. She was noise and brash destruction, and he would slip unseen through her defenses. He watched her and recognized in her an equivalent lack of morality, but she had none of the grace or restraint he had cultivated. She did not represent any level of rule of law. She was fire, a volcano, pouring and storming down wrath. She was a soldier-trained class, no biotics, no technical skills. Her fighting style was reflected in her personality. She was explosive, and those around her must become accustomed to shrapnel raining down on the battlefield or in a conversation. Set her off, and she would take you with her. He had done a great deal of research regarding his Siha since coming aboard. Much of his time had been spent surveying records and accounts of her career. She had a first name, but he would not call her by it under any circumstances. She was his Siha, and that was the only name she needed from him. He would call her Commander or Shepard if his silence failed. One of her names was the Butcher of Torfan. Shepard would grant no forgiveness, and he craved the arid clarity of ruthlessness. It granted him the freedom to behave as he truly was, as she needed him to be. The gods had put him in her hands, put her in his hands, because they would fit like two twisted, carved pieces, too intricate to interlock unless it had been by design. Ruth. A feeling of pity, distress, or grief. Ruthless. Having or showing no pity or compassion for others. Erica had been the essence of Ruth, and his passion for her had been protective, gentle, and ultimately lost to the careless restlessness of his truer self. A less wise man might think that Erica would hate him for his actions, that she watched him from the shores with anger and condemnation. The truth was not that. It would be easier if it were that. He could bear being castigated by Erica. It would be justice. He would be severed from her will, rejected. But she would never hate. Her internal workings immune to the corruption that would bring. He imagined her hollow, composed of light, all the horrors that life could create splashing through her as she remained unchanged. No place for hate or anger to stick to or rise from her like steam. After her death as a pure spirit, she would redouble her ethereal insistence on kindness and forgiveness. She would always welcome him. He had developed an edge of contempt for unconditional love, and that edge had cored him cleanly. Softer nature cauterized and bloodless. Ironic, Erica, that in avenging you I defiled your memory and your light, strengthened my dedication to the things, the person you despised. It would have been better had you taken mercy on me upon our first meeting and torn my heart from my chest. I would have thanked you with blood-tinged lips. He did not deserve forgiveness, and yet she would let it fall upon him like rain, and he himself would transmute it into a wash of acid upon his skin. That was his penance. That was his eternal penance, to be bound to a Siha who would dismiss his honed and hard-bought nature as insignificant, unworthy of notice, set aside in favor of future potential as perhaps a delicacy merchant in the mountains, his value measured by the texture of the canon he peddled. The fact that she had been right, and if he had remained useless at her side she would still be alive, was the corruption born in his bones like his marred blood, passing its insidious destruction delicately through his body and mind, robbing him of his air and inspiration. He died not all at once through mercy, but with the slow, immeasurable cellular suffocation he could not comprehend in its mechanism. Being struck with Keprel syndrome was another lesson of the gods, a rebuke to his utility. The venom of his skin was seemingly composed of this knowledge and of carefully, chemically, and surgically supplemented alterations based on Hanar training to make it virulently hypnotic and hallucinogenic. His mistake with Erica had been in the arrogance he'd undertaken to love Asiha instead of serving her. He would take this second chance and observe the lessons of his first tragic encounter and eviscerating bond. Shepard had no defenses against venom or biotics, and he could physically overpower her with ease, but it was not solely her body that he required. In order to guide her path, he must be able to influence her actions, and for that, he must be in her blood, in her ear, in her body. He must be able to learn her will so fully that he could suggest it to her, transfer his will back to her as her own. She would not respond to rein or pull. She must want to turn, as though the thought arose from her own mind. He had no doubt he could attract her, as a Drell with the attendant mysteries and intimacies, as an assassin with his reputation, grace, and danger. He was wanted. Across species lines, across genders, who he was had a language of its own that whispered to those who watched. Shepard would know him as her tool, as her weapon, and she would grow to wonder what other uses his graceful hands could serve. Perhaps for her it would be purely lust. Perhaps for him it would be service to further a goal. He had done it often enough in his career for seduction to be routine. Seduction was a tool for gathering information, for coercion, for camouflage. It was one of the most useful tools he had and the most versatile, providing leverage, information, and access. Perhaps it was ego. Perhaps the need to prove that he could. Perhaps to prove to her that he could. Prove to the gods that no task was beyond him. A feat comparable to finding a great predatory beast of the sea and swimming alongside until fingertips brushed skin like armored scales. If he did not behave like prey, did not thrash, did not strain from the lack of oxygen in his lungs, the beast would turn in curiosity, brush against his hand of its own volition because of the novelty of contact, the lack of fear. He would not strain from the lack of oxygen in his lungs. It would kill him, but he would not strain. She would be accustomed to fear and confusion, begging and propitiation, as he was. She would have no need for the pressured begging of someone trying to light themselves from her fire, save themselves from her wrath, ask of her something that her power could give them when nothing else would serve. Those who wanted power might want begging and propitiation, but that was for those who never truly accustomed themselves to power. Political power was one thing, and those there needed the fear of the ruled, so there was a need in that type of power to fear loss of influence. Power over life and death was a different type of power entirely. There was only one vote and the will to carry out the decree. Shepard did not care about begging, need, or fear unless they got her what she wanted, be that information, cooperation, or surrender. Thane was the same. He needed her information, cooperation, and surrender, and she would understand that fully over time. She would be distracted by the idea that he could kill her, betray her, and that would waste her time as he bound her through unquestioned obedience. His goal would remain cloaked, as she would not suspect that he did not intend her death, but his own. He was among talented people, but his Siha bewildered and intimidated the majority of those on the Normandy. Her closest relationship, approaching friendship, was with Garrus Vicarian. He had noticed and had researched Garrus as well. He had been part of her original crew, one of those who had fought Sovereign and Saren. Deadly with a rifle. Garrus was roiling with anger from past injustices, and the only time his voice softened or judgment faded from his mutilated face was when he spoke to his Siha, cajoling or supporting as it suited him. Never disagreeing, never intimidating her with his greater height or strength, never anything suggesting mutiny. Garrus would abide by her judgment and would in fact put his own mind through impossible acrobatics to support her, contradicting ideals he held 5 minutes ago in anecdote to support the decision she had just made. Murder became necessary, and overt cruelty became a praised tactic behind his eyes, on his skewed tongue. She saw that dichotomy, as did Thane. Garrus did not see it that way, his justifications reverse engineering her needs and setting labels on her behavior as righteous. She was not righteous. Along with Garrus's versions of her behavior, he could see the shift in her eyes from knowing she was supported to knowing that she demanded that twisting in him, never altering her decisions to placate her second-in-command. Thane wondered if she had ever been seen, had ever had her armored scales brushed in the depths like the sea beast of teeth, and cold. Had she not wished to be seen, she would not have joined military service with ranks and medals. She would have lived in a thieves' den somewhere, amassing her hoard of treasures and dead bodies to guard. Then there would be no seeing her, only putting her body on top of that pile or becoming a part of it himself. Thane would see her but not reveal her to others, and she would know she was known. This woman did not care to be known by most, but she did not reject the admiration or approval of those who knew the twists and turns and blind alleys of killing. She was competitive, tracking kills callously with Garrus, arguing over the merits of a gun over a fist, up close from remote. That was the path to her weaknesses, following the sinuous curves of her strengths to the breaks in her armor. Everyone bent somewhere and longed for motion in those places. And they were the most vulnerable spots. He would not attribute normal motivations to her. She would not desire love or approval, but she would be a very unusual person if she had no curiosity, if she experienced no desire for like body pressed to like body, twisting together like the carvings of the gods, and taking new shape. Garrus was the only member of the crew who knew her as a colleague, had spent time with her, had been chosen by her in days long past, had been chosen by her again, not left to bleed to death, broken and useless, on the tiles of an improvised bunker on Omega. Garrus had been called by his spirits, spoken to in the tradition of the Taurian past, just as the Drell gods spoke to Thane. Called to serve. Thane approved of Garrus, this fate-shaped, cross-species team displaying symmetry of purpose, something Thane had not experienced, having always worked alone. There was no time for contemplation or prayer over the bodies of the dead. She, Garrus, and Thane piled up more bodies in a single day than Thane had in a year of his previous life. He listened while appearing not to listen as they argued over whether or not a swiftly cooling body had a shot in the middle of the forehead or slightly to the side, as they stepped over it in their stalking, unhurried path to the next wave of provoked, brutal slaughter. Thane fit into their style and strategy like water slipping between rocks, surprise and appreciation in their faces in the form of raised brows, low whistles, and satisfied nods. He read the battlefield. They read him. He knew within the first few waves that Shepard would tend to go right, as Garrus tended to go left, and he would choose targets of his own, the habits of an assassin concealing his methods and occasionally the bodies themselves, before passing on to a new target. His own contributions to the carnage going without counting, without demanding recognition. The idea of having support was something he would not indulge in himself. He need only be supportive. Flight Lieutenant Moreau and Dr. Chakwas had been in her crew previously, but navigation and medical assistance did not allow the opportunity to observe under combat conditions. He respected Garrus, but Garrus would not be competition for her, not affection. There would be no affection. Her attention. If they had any interest in that direction, there was no hint of it, their relationship that of seasoned soldiers. They trusted and respected each other, but that was no threat. The Turian might possibly be interested in her, but his pace of pursuing was glacial, and his understanding of her character occluded by his Turian respect for command structure and his personal need for some meaning he felt compelled to give her, mirroring his own, that she did not possess. She was not justice, and that was Garrus's ultimate love. What she was instead was courage, audacity, and brutality in pursuit of a goal worth pursuing, against those who would end all human life, all Drell life, all Turian life, in their ambitions. They were only recently reunited, she and Garrus, their paths divergent over years. Death hung on her, the span like a garland, haunting those around her. Garrus had mourned her death, and the death of her purpose, and the shadows of that were in Garrus's face, when he was not aware he was being observed. Garrus had lost his soul after Shepard had died, just as Thane had lost his when Erica was wrenched from life. Garrus's immersion in carnage, while needing to insulate himself from a repetition of such a loss, was understandable. He felt a kinship with the men, an understanding of torn dreams. Garrus would never take without permission, and his Siha would never grant permission. His Siha required actions, not words. He doubted that even if his Siha thought of Garrus as a possible partner, that she would risk the easy reliance they had upon each other, as though they were each a blade in a pair of perfectly honed scissors, closing together with a snap and satisfied eyes. Garrus was an enforcer, and extension of her will, able to put a shine on her motivations, make her appear noble to others, absolutely able to squelch dissent in any team composed of part Shepard, part Vicarian. He was ex-CSEC, related to fame and high in the hierarchy himself if he chose to disclose that, reclaim that. She would not waste that potential, that influence on sex. Garrus was the definition of versatile and useful. Garrus was an idealistic person, and their relationship proved she cared enough to likely be concerned about tearing his heart from his chest, which she would do without thought, through sheer reflex and presence. She needed his rifle, needed Garrus watching interlopers such as himself, those who might have ulterior motives. She needed Garrus outside her chaotic event horizon, the tearing gravity of her inner self. She might not care about the destruction of a lover's illusions, but she would care about losing the Turian's watchful and perceptive eyes over her shoulder. Those same eyes that turned over her shoulder, flash reading the attitude and intent of her squad mates. Those eyes had moved to Thane, speculative and suspicious, later approving and surprised. Her eyes would move to others on the ship, impatient and mocking. Yet when her eyes moved to Garrus, it was as though she were surveying her rifle or her armor. She expected him to be where he was, and he was always where she expected, and there was no ripple of thought. She took him entirely for granted, and he, in Turian fashion, strove to be that for her. Necessary in battle, making Garrus indispensable. As an obvious sign on the path, he must use that information. He must draw her attention. He must be as indispensable as Garrus, but not be what or where she expects. Being indispensable would be simple. Choosing in which way to be not what she expects would require further meditation. She must be aware of him in each moment, if he were in range of her sight, and she must wonder what he was thinking or doing when he was out of her sight. Thane must intrude upon her thoughts, expectations, and patterns in each moment and elicit curiosity in her. Thane had no purpose in the light, unlike Garrus. He was useful but not versatile. He had no family that would be outraged by potential mistreatment, no political ties, no authoritative voice. He had no morals. That was his next step on his path. Thane was best suited to her event horizon because he had no illusions, and because none of the meaningful actions he had taken in his professional life had ever involved permission. He'd found a few monitoring devices in the life support section, which suited him well. He would like to break into Shepard's cabin, ideally, but there was no way to circumvent the AI on the ship that he had yet determined, and the risk of discovery was too great. Instead, he repurposed the monitoring devices and their transmission output to more discreet and anonymous settings, and placed them around the ship, primarily in the battery, where Garrus was stationed because it was private, and it was Thane's best opportunity to observe the pair and their confidences when alone behind closed doors for extended periods of time. He set another device in the common area to pick up the largest amount of conversation and gossip, and he set the final device in the shuttle, which he knew would be another spot for strategic and private conversation. Surveillance was of interest, but he also needed to be out in the ship, in plain sight, integrating with crew. He had no reason to go up to the CIC or the captain's cabin, but everyone made their way down to the crew deck several times a day, and so there he would be, often. He would retire to life support for meditation and data gathering, but he needed to attract her attention, and the best way to do that was with his body. He learned his Siha's patterns, and discovered when it would be most likely that she would seek him out, spending those times in physical exertion in the cargo bay. Part of his normal daily ritual, but something most often done in private. The exposure was jarring, and he modified his practice to conceal those things that were not to be shown to others, moves he would not use in combat out in the open. The wide open space was a challenge to his perceptions and caused a tickling awareness of how many places there were from which to attack. Crates as cover, the bulk of the shuttle itself, too many entrances. He made it part of his routine to change position to face each of these potential threat locations smoothly in turn, adding a measure of difficulty to the balance and strength exercises he knew as muscle habit. He had lost approximately 7% of his speed, his strength, his stamina since the onset of Kepral syndrome, but the work still moved through his muscles like water. His pursuit of Shepard was always camouflaged, consisting mostly of lure. His exercise became his exercise, with the possible goal of attracting her attention. His meals became his meals, with the possibility of gaining the confidence of someone on the ship who might speak of her without prompting. If he prompted, all would be lost. He'd risk building a pattern of suspicion. His entire nature and nurture had been one of patience for the hunt, and this being more of the same, it was easy to simply be as he was. Watch and listen. He would ask nobody about her, ask nothing of her, merely provide opportunities for things to be told to him, questions to be asked of him. Kelly Chambers' attention was a risk, but this was all about managed risk. Kelly had openly and demonstrably made it clear that she was available for whatever orientation to human behavior he might wish. She was tempting in a tactical sense, having all of the information and dossiers and patterns of those on board. There was no reason to discourage her. She was not tempting as a bedmate, and Thane struggled with this aspect of his mission. The context of Kelly made him consider what it was to be with a human. He had only known he must be with a Siha. Humans and Drell were close enough anatomically, but no venom, no shifting iridescence of skin, all the things of Drell allure missing in creatures of limited texture and color. His Siha was red, and had scars that provided texture, glowed with color. Her eyes were exotic in their delicate, small size, the reactive and ever-changing colors revealing or disguising internal workings, the muscles that formed her expressions like puppet strings. Kelly had cornered him at meals, in meditation, and had found him in his extended workout sessions in the cargo bay, effusive and curious about his practice, asking for demonstrations. He obliged. It would make him seem more social, more engaged, more open to human companionship. Drell were not so great in number, not like humans or Taurians. Drell were exotic and rare to the other species, even to Asari, sought out, but often reclusive, finding their pleasures with their own kind. To lack venom, and therefore the visions that came with sex, to lack the rivers of bright color undulating on skin, to lack a frill. It appeared that humans had inferior gods of creation. They had structure, but little style in comparison. Kelly was a simple tool, and as such could be wielded easily, if bluntly. She was not usable for fine work, but she was not any level of threat to his plan, and could be the means to further it should opportunities present themselves. He taught her the basic opening moves of a child's form, correcting her technique by pulling her to him to demonstrate, his mouth at her ear, his hands not lingering but not leaving quickly. She was child's play, and he had to remind himself to speak as an adult and not lighten or lessen his voice to reflect her transparent enthusiasm and catches of breath. Perhaps this could be practice of some sort. She provided human physiology and reactions he could study. Dilation of pupils, sweat, formation, change in scent, softening of muscles, receptive body posture. Over time, she showed no intent to politely leave him to continue his exercise. So at the appointed end of his time to study, he took his own leave, thanking her for her time. Another lesson in human physiology. Disappointment. The days passed, his schedule solidified, and he became predictable in his location. His Siha did not inform him of their schedule or their missions, and his time was entirely his own. She had only come by for the most basic of discourse, history, and theology lessons about Drell society. She had spoken to him only in life support, and now he was not there. Kelly had no difficulty determining his patterns and pursuing him. He was certainly easy to pursue when he was standing still. One day with Kelly disingenuously mistaking one form for another, a specific form that would require correction with his hands on her body. His Siha had been there, shoulders braced against the wall, watching. His heart beat hard with satisfaction, and his eyes flowed around her, not seeing her, not seeing that she leaned against the wall, watching, not caring if he saw. He did not see, but Kelly did, and she jumped, flustered and seemingly guilty, allowing that to escape through her mouth and muscles, waving ostentatiously to Shepard. "Commander, what brings you here?" Foolish question. Shepard kicked away from the wall. "Just on my rounds. Checking in. Krios has been difficult to find." Thane turned to her. "My apologies. Had I known you sought me, I would have made myself available. I am available now, if you wish." Shepard raised a brow, taking in Kelly's flushed face. "I'd hate to interrupt." Kelly could not leave fast enough. Shepard shook her head. "Is she bothering you? She's supposed to be at her station, but she started disappearing during certain intervals in her shift. She's pretty much useless, but I'm relieved to see that she's doing this rather than sending out messages in a bottle to Cerberus HQ." "No, she is not bothering me. She appears to have an interest in Drell culture." "All right, but tell me, you have better taste." Thane tilted his head and misunderstood her deliberately. "I have been told that I taste as a Drell should." "Oh, that may be one of the better translator glitches I've ever heard. How should a Drell taste?" "Sweet, over a note of richness, with the aftertaste of Tyramit." "Tyramit?" "Didn't translate." "A light stinging on the tongue that is relieved by tasting again until the venom has saturated the blood. Like quenching deep thirst. An addictive sensation." My, Drell culture is interesting. Try not to break my crew, Krios. I need them able to work. Your crew is safely out of my hands. Other than any combat instruction that may be required or requested, they do not interest me. He had emphasized the word they carefully. She heard it, and a speculative shadow passed through her eyes. His Siha was no fool. The volcano could be subtle and could read people when she chose. She continued as though she had not heard it. "All right, I'll take your word. This isn't an Alliance ship, and I never did actually care who was fucking like bunnies, but I would request that you not overburden Dr. Shakwas with hallucinating young women, or young men, or whatever you're into. Although if you could talk Zaid into it, I'd pay to watch." That had made him laugh, and he saw her in that moment, surprise on her face at his laughter, her face free of her deeper menaces. This is how she spoke with Garrus. This is where she felt most comfortable. His status in the ship hierarchy was clarifying, and her opinion of him rising. He could likely break Kelly's neck, and his Siha would shrug and get a body bag, but if something was happening, she wanted to know. "My arms are yours, if you could assist me with the best method to seduce a human male." I would do my best. Stop. I want to. I really want to, and I can't look Zaid in the eye for a few days. Do not tempt me. That's a lot of power you're giving me there, Krios. It appears human culture is interesting as well. I look forward to future illumination on the subject. She seemed to sober and recover, but her eyes were dancing. All right. At this rate, so do I. We understand one another. She turned to leave, but pivoted back on her heel after a few steps. Wait, I got distracted by vivid imagery. There was something I wanted to say. Since everyone on the ship is about to potentially die on my word, they seem to have all discovered dying wishes. Fulfilling those wishes is problematic. They're not legal, they're not military, and they are as dangerous as anything else we've done, with no reward other than someone slightly more willing to focus on dying. I need to keep the content of the missions confidential to avoid more infighting bullshit. You seem to be one of the only people on this boat that can keep their mouths shut, and you have not once whined about my methods. You didn't punch Jacob when he insulted you, and I know I have one less feud on board because of that discretion. I promised you that I intended to survive this mission, but I need to make sure everyone else has the best chance I can give them to work together, since they are putting everything on the line at my call. I know you signed up to fight collectors, and you signed up for free and have asked for nothing in return. Her eyes clouded, and her face transformed momentarily with the first glancing hints toward vulnerability he'd seen in her. Her eyes hardened when she realized she was nearing the word please or positive praise. I need this bullshit squared. Think about it. Let me know. She turned to leave. He thought, I have not asked, but I will take, and whatever is required in service will be given. She wished to abandon the conversation and its implications, but he did not grant her time. After she'd taken a few steps, he said, You have my arm and my silence. Whatever you require will be as my own will. She turned her head only part way. Good. When she had gone, he continued his exercise until his scheduled time had passed. As his feet whispered over the deck, he recalled her laughter. He searched her face for those moments that revealed her humanity, rather than concealing it under layers of careful armor. She made pursuit easy through her blunt insistence on having no outward reaction to him. She made pursuit difficult through remaining suspicious of his motives. She made pursuit possible by not being suspicious enough and having her curiosity snag on him and stick. Having attracted her attention, he knew well enough not to alter his habit of exercise. It would raise suspicion of having been manufactured. Kelly had not returned, but his Siha had. In the same place, shoulders slouched against the wall in contrast to her sharp eyes, one foot kicked back against the wall in a casual observer stance as he traveled through his familiar exercises. Again, he purposely did not see her, considering and attempting to decipher her behavior. Perhaps she only wished to keep Kelly at her post, but had that been the case, she could have intimidated her directly, and he believed Kelly to be intimidated enough for several lifetimes. Whatever her intentions, they were either for her own reasons that had nothing to do with him, or she wished to get his attention. Therefore, he would not give it to her. He could easily lie to her if she confronted him, explain that in Drell culture a subordinate may be seen but not heard unless addressed. It would not be true, but her pride would not allow her to argue. Otherwise, she would have to admit that she wanted his attention as a woman, and not as a commander. Why stand silently when she could command his attention with a word? Commander Shepard? How odd. He left her to her own thoughts, and at some point in the face of his determined serenity in her presence, after her eyes slipped over the sinews of his bared chest and arms, she had left, and he was able to smile. She returned day after day, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for longer, the hunger and speculation growing on her face as she assumed she was not seen, that he was absorbed in the smooth form that connected his breath to his bones, muscles strained and light, playing along the kaleidoscopic color of his skin. One day she pressed the issue by staying in her accustomed place for a long time, and to the point that he would end his work. That left him with no choice. He must end his workout on time, leave through his accustomed exit where she stood, guarding it. He must finally see her. She demanded it. He turned to incline his head to her neutrally on his way out. She stormed behind him in the hallway. "Motherfucking Drell asshole!" He knew he had her. The pretense had worked, but she knew it as pretense. Her volcanic wrath confronted him, pyroclastic flow in her eyes and under her skin, hands of warm, heaving stone. Her eyes met his for only a brief moment, his carefully neutral, hers searching for any suggestion of his own passion, which he denied her. She would need to convince him. He met her eyes with puzzled detachment. Her hands were on his upper arms, and he allowed her to turn him and slam his back against a wall. She lunged for him, and her mouth was on his, pushing his head back with force. Her lips were demanding, lacking the central rift and firmer texture that divided Drell lips into quarters. Her lips were softer, warmer, and a disorienting, pleasure-slicked surprise. He restrained his reaction to her, pitching his responses to degrees below her own, enough to let her know he enjoyed her kiss, but not enough to let her know that her kiss was the goal of all the effort he had taken since he'd first seen her. When her tongue traced the surface of his lips, he allowed a satisfied, warm sigh on his outbreath. He did not meet her tongue with his, but waited for Tyramid and her mouth to do their work, fulfill their potential. Foretold by him, but not properly foreseen by her, he knew to the moment when venom infiltrated her nerves, creating an imperative that she had to answer with either flight or commitment to the moment. She stiffened, pulled back, wild disbelief in her eyes. He dropped his eyes from hers, focused on the reddening curve of her lips. His lips did not tingle as they would had she been Drell, but he vicariously enjoyed her helplessness in contrast to his straight spine, seemingly unaffected. He had her, but she could bolt and he would let her if she chose to. She would struggle with clamoring need against self-preservation. He knew his Siha was reckless and courageous, and if she chose to stay, she still would not admit defeat. She was not a creature of self-denial, her strengths transformed into weaknesses with his venom in her blood. Self-denial was his wellspring. She could not compete with him there. He was at home, a tiger in their own territory. Dappled sun and leaves and knot, stripes and teeth. Right now he could subdue her with biotics, speak softly, and have anything from her. But it would not be enough. It would not be her will, so he would wait until the promise of Tyramid wreaked its havoc on her over time. He was in her blood, and when he left, it would drag her back to his side, hungry. Her eyes closed and conditional surrender tripped over her features. Unknown territory. Fuck! Without opening her eyes, she lunged for him again, no longer kissing with pressed lips, but licking at him, tentative and then voracious. One of her hands slid to the back of his head and lingered. Expectations denied again. He had no hair for her seeking fingertips. Proving his expectations would be met as hers weren't, he slid his hand behind her head in mimicry, tangling her hair between his fingers, imagining the familiar green against the vibrant red, sliding through and tightening, but not pulling her head back. One day, he would bend her head back, bend her spine with his arm around her waist as fulcrum, a hand tangled in her hair as she sought out his skin with hunger. Today, he allowed her head to stay under her control. She had her head and yet did nothing with it but press closer to him, closer than if he'd crushed her to him. He needed to appear as though he kept no score, sought no power, merely gave in indulgently and obediently to her whims, as compliant as when she pointed at someone for him to kill, as she took it for granted that he would. He took her hand that was still on his arm and guided it, unresisting, to his upper chest, her fingertips spasming lightly against the beat of his heart and the whisper of her skin over the texture there. More things she did not know. He offered her the expanse of his skin, open to her mouth, open to her hands, which would also absorb and slowly take in venom. He gave her the subtler clue of his devotion, his elevated heart rate, but doubted that she could register it. She was experiencing her body taken in the heated glow of building Tyramid. Her fingers tangled with his and tightened, and at the gesture, his heart leaped further in pace. It was not in her nature or her knowledge to go slow, to let Tyramid set its own pace. The custom was of languors sharing, trusting in the slow infusion, the mindset of pleasure setting its own tone for the visions, emotional content intensifying sensation and dictating the halos of light that bathed the lover. His Siha was glutted, disoriented, frantic, the isolation of her swearing assault reflected in what she felt and what she saw, unable to assimilate and reliant upon him to keep her knees from giving way. She was moaning, little nips of her teeth on his lips, and his expectation of detached service evaporated. The way she smelled, the way she sounded, the heat sheeting from her. He knew he would not be disappointed, craved continuing this fleeting opportunity to drive her body to the opposite wall, press her to it, feel her open under the pressure of his voice and his hands, know how it felt to drive into her as she was unable to stop her mouth from returning to him again and again. His body insisted it was to be, and he was caught in his own internal struggle, his cock hard against the form-fitted leather. His hand left her hair and traveled down her spine to cup her body at the hip, press her tight against him, his soft groan against her mouth. His mind echoed with ardent and measured words. He focused on the control it took to not whisper them against her skin. I have you, Sia. Having tasted me, you will return to me with hunger and need. You will quake under my ready palms, open under my mouth, spread under my covering body, and you will burn. I promise you this. And I promise the gods that crowd this seemingly empty hallway, watching and waiting to see that their will comes to pass. He had been wrong about two things. It was not only service that bent his body to hers, and his lust spiked hard and fierce at the press of her. It was not only lust that drove her to grip his hand as though she were drowning, and he her only salvation. Lust only would press her assuredly closer, but she pulled back in a startle as though burned. And perhaps she had been. Lust he would have followed alone, and if she wanted to rut in a hallway, he would do it and ignore anybody walking through as he had ignored her so completely in the shuttle bay. They were both more complicated than he had given them credit in the cold contemplation of process. She was breathing hard as she pulled entirely back, and he let her go with regretful hands, slipping from her body in a final caress before relinquishing his grip on her hand and delivering her back to herself and her unsteady knees. The wall bolstered his balance. His knees were not as steady as he would wish. His heated eyes followed her, watched as she struggled for control over her impulses, her eyes, her voice. Fucking drill! Damn it, Krios! I do not need this. His lips curled in a light smile. You could have proven that by not slamming me against a wall. Have a care for the delicacy of my bones. Taking full advantage of the acute hypnotic effect that Tyramit carried from his tailored venom, he suggested to her what she might do to gain his attention at any time, knowing it would simmer in her memory, through her blood, when hunger for him struck her again, spike along her system now while it sang to her. I have offered you my arm in battle. I extend that invitation to include my body at your service when you choose, in or out of battle, As you desire. She jammed frustrated fingers through her hair, combing out where he'd tangled it. She looked at his lips and the expansive skin on his chest with hunger, and then tore herself away. She kept her eyes determinedly closed, swaying. Fuck you, Thane. He opened his arms with practiced grace and inclined his head. As you wish. When you wish. With a disgusted grunt, she spun and took the turn too hard, rebounding against her lack of balance and putting a hand out to steady herself against the wall. Her head dropped. Damn it. You didn't see that. That's an order. He nodded. I did not see that. She steadied herself and marched more purposefully down the corridor. Damned right!